ಸ್ನೇಹಿತರೆ ನಮಸ್ಕಾರ. ಬೆಂಗಳೂರು ಹಿಸ್ಟೋರಿಯನ್ ಸೊಸೈಟಿ, ಇತಿಹಾಸ ದರ್ಪಣ ಹಾಗೂ ಋತುಮಾನ.com ಸಂಯುಕ್ತ ಆಶ್ರಯದಲ್ಲಿ ನಡೀತಾ ಇರತಕ್ಕಂತಹ ಅರಿವಿನ ನೀರಿಗೆ ಸರಣಿಯ 18ನೇ ಉಪನ್ಯಾಸಕ್ಕೆ ತಮ್ಗೆಲ್ರಿಗೂ ಕೂಡ ಸ್ವಾಗತ. ಇವತ್ತು ನಮ್ಮ ನಡುವೆ ಇದ್ದಾರೆ ಸೌಮ್ಯ ದೇಚಮ್ಮ ಅವರು. ಅವರ ಕಿರು ಪರಿಚಯವನ್ನ ಮಾಡ್ತಾ ಅವರನ್ನ ವಿಷಯ ಮಂಡನೆಗಾಗಿ ನಾನು ಆಹ್ವಾನ ಮಾಡ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದೇನೆ. ಸೌಮ್ಯ ದೇಚಮ್ಮ ಅವರು ತಮ್ಮ PhD ಮತ್ತು MPhil ಪದವಿಯನ್ನ ಹೈದರಾಬಾದ್ ಯೂನಿವರ್ಸಿಟಿಯಿಂದ 2001 ಮತ್ತು 2007ರಲ್ಲಿ PhD ಪದವಿಯನ್ನು ಪಡೀತಾರೆ. ಸದ್ಯ ಅವರು ಹೈದರಾಬಾದ್ನ ಸೆಂಟರ್ ಫಾರ್ ಕಂಪ್ಯಾರಿಟಿವ್ ಲಿಟ್ರೇಚರ್ ನಲ್ಲಿ ಪ್ರೊಫೆಸರ್ ಆಗಿ ಮತ್ತು ಮುಖ್ಯಸ್ಥಿಯಾಗಿ ಕಾರ್ಯನಿರ್ವಹಿಸ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದಾರೆ. ಅದೇ ಕೇಂದ್ರದಲ್ಲಿ ಸರಿಸುಮಾರು 2015ರಿಂದ 2018ರವರೆಗೆ ಅಸೋಸಿಯೇಟ್ ಪ್ರೊಫೆಸರ್ ಆಗಿ ಅವರು ಕೆಲಸ ಮಾಡಿರ್ತಾರೆ ಮತ್ತು 2004ರಿಂದ 2015ರವರೆಗೆ ಅಸಿಸ್ಟೆಂಟ್ ಪ್ರೊಫೆಸರ್ ಆಗಿ ಕೆಲಸ ಮಾಡಿರ್ತಾರೆ. ಅವರು 2004-2003 ಹೊತ್ತಿಗೆ ದೆಹಲಿಯ ಜಾಮಿಯಾ ಮಿಲಿಯಾ ಇಸ್ಲಾಮಿಯಾ ಯೂನಿವರ್ಸಿಟಿಯಲ್ಲಿ ಅಲ್ಲಿನ ಇಂಗ್ಲಿಷ್ ಮತ್ತು ಮಾಡರ್ನ್ ಯುರೋಪಿಯನ್ ಲ್ಯಾಂಗ್ವೇಜಸ್ ವಿಭಾಗದಲ್ಲಿ ಇಂಗ್ಲಿಷ್ ವಿಭಾಗದಲ್ಲಿ ವಿಷಯದಲ್ಲಿ ಲೆಕ್ಚರ್ ಆಗಿ ಕೂಡ ಕಾರ್ಯನಿರ್ವಹಿಸಿದ್ದಾರೆ. ಅವರ ಮುಖ್ಯವಾದ ಸಂಶೋಧನೆ ಮತ್ತು ಬೋಧನೆ ಆಸಕ್ತಿಗಳು ಹೇಗಿದೆ: ಭಾರತದ ಸಾಹಿತ್ಯ, ವಿಶೇಷವಾಗಿ ಮೈನಾರಿಟೀಸ್ ಐಡೆಂಟಿಟೀಸ್ ಮತ್ತು ಡಿಸ್ಕೋರ್ಸ್, ಅನುವಾದ ಸಾಹಿತ್ಯ, ಭಾಷಾ ಮತ್ತು ಸಾಂಸ್ಕೃತಿಕ ಅಧ್ಯಯನದ ಸಂವಾದ ಅಥವಾ ವಾಗ್ವಾದಗಳು, ವಿಶೇಷವಾಗಿ ಕೊಡವ ಸಂಸ್ಕೃತಿಗೆ ಸಂಬಂಧಪಟ್ಟ ಹಾಗೆ. ಸೌಮ್ಯ ಅವರಿಗೆ ಸಂದಿರ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥ ಫೆಲೋಶಿಪ್ ಮತ್ತು ಪ್ರಮುಖವಾದಂತಹ ಅವಾರ್ಡ್ಗಳು 2009ನಲ್ಲಿ ಅವರು ಫುಲ್ ಬ್ರೈಟ್ ಫೆಲೋ ಆಗಿ ಮಾಡರ್ನ್ ಇಂಡಿಯನ್ ಲಿಟರರಿ ಕಲ್ಚರ್ಸ್ ಅಂಡ್ ರಿಸರ್ಚ್ ಆನ್ ಅಂಡರ್ಸ್ಟ್ಯಾಂಡಿಂಗ್ ದ ಮಾಡರ್ನ್ ಅನ್ನುವ ವಿಷಯದ ಮೇಲೆ ಕ್ವೀನ್ಸ್ ಕಾಲೇಜ್ನಲ್ಲಿ ಅಮೆರಿಕಾದ ಯೂನಿವರ್ಸಿಟಿ ಆಫ್ ನ್ಯೂಯಾರ್ಕ್ ನಲ್ಲಿ ಫುಲ್ ಬ್ರೈಟ್ ಫೆಲೋ ಆಗಿ ಕಾರ್ಯನಿರ್ವಹಿಸ್ತಾರೆ. 2010-2011ರಲ್ಲಿ ಕಾಮನ್ವೆಲ್ತ್ ಫೆಲೋಶಿಪ್ ಅನ್ನ ಅವರು UKಯ ಯೂನಿವರ್ಸಿಟಿ ಆಫ್ ಸೌಥ್ಯಾಂಪ್ಟನ್ ನಲ್ಲಿ ಪಡೀತಾರೆ. 2004ರಲ್ಲಿ UGCಯ ಜೂನಿಯರ್ ರಿಸರ್ಚ್ ಫೆಲೋಶಿಪ್ ಅನ್ನು ಕೂಡ ಅವರು ಪಡೀತಾರೆ. 2005ರಲ್ಲಿ ಅಮೆರಿಕಾದ ಸಾಂತಾಕ್ರೂಸ್ ಅಥವಾ ಯೂನಿವರ್ಸಿಟಿ ಆಫ್ ಕ್ಯಾಲಿಫೋರ್ನಿಯಾ, ಸಾಂತಾಕ್ರೂಸ್ ನಲ್ಲಿ ಇರತಕ್ಕಂಥ ಯೂನಿವರ್ಸಿಟಿ ಆಫ್ ಕ್ಯಾಲಿಫೋರ್ನಿಯಾದಲ್ಲಿ ಸುಮಾರು 1 ವರ್ಷಗಳ ಕಾಲ ವಿಸಿಟಿಂಗ್ ಸ್ಕಾಲರ್ ಫೆಲೋ ಆಗಿ ಕೂಡ ಕಾರ್ಯನಿರ್ವಹಿಸಿದ್ದಾರೆ. 2007ರಲ್ಲಿ ಅವರ PhD ಥೀಸಿಸ್ ಏನಿದೆ ಅದು ಹೈದರಾಬಾದ್ನ ಡೀನ್ಸ್ ಮೆರಿಟ್ ಅವಾರ್ಡ್ ಅನ್ನು ಕೂಡ ಪಡ್ಕೊಂಡಿದೆ. 2010ರಲ್ಲಿ ಅವರು ಇಂಡೋ ಹಂಗೇರಿಯನ್ ಎಜುಕೇಶನ್ ಎಕ್ಸ್ಚೇಂಜ್ ಪ್ರೋಗ್ರಾಮ್ ನಲ್ಲಿ ಭಾಗವಹಿಸ್ತಾರೆ. 2015ರಲ್ಲಿ ಹೈದರಾಬಾದ್ ಯೂನಿವರ್ಸಿಟಿ ಕೊಡಮಾಡತಕ್ಕಂತಹ ಚಾನ್ಸಲರ್ ಅವಾರ್ಡ್ ಅನ್ನು ಕೂಡ ತಮ್ಮ ಸಂಶೋಧನೆ ಮತ್ತು ಬೋಧನೆಗೋಸ್ಕರ ಪಡೀತಾರೆ. ಅವರ ಪ್ರಮುಖ ಬರಹಗಳು, ತುಂಬಾ ಮುಖ್ಯವಾದ ಬರಹಗಳು, ಒಂದು ಈ ಸತ್ಯಪ್ರಕಾಶ್ ಅವರ ಜೊತೆಗೆ ಸಹ ಸಂಪಾದನೆ ಮಾಡಿದಂತಹ ಸಿನಿಮಾಸ್ ಆಫ್ ಸೌತ್ ಇಂಡಿಯಾ, ಕಲ್ಚರ್, ಐಡಿಯಾಲಜಿ, ರೆಸಿಸ್ಟೆನ್ಸ್ ಅನ್ನುವ ಪುಸ್ತಕ ಆಕ್ಸ್ಫರ್ಡ್ ಯೂನಿವರ್ಸಿಟಿಯಿಂದ 2010ರಲ್ಲಿ ಪ್ರಕಟ ಆಗಿದೆ. ಅವರ ಪ್ರಮುಖ ಸಂಶೋಧನಾ ಬರಹಗಳು ದ ಮಾಡೆಲ್ ಮೈನಾರಿಟಿ, ಪ್ರಾಬ್ಲಮಟೈಸಿಂಗ್ ದ ರೆಪ್ರೆಸೆಂಟೇಷನ್ ಆಫ್ ಕೊಡವಾಸ್ ಇನ್ ಕನ್ನಡ ಅನ್ನುವ ಪ್ರಬಂಧ ಇಂಟರ್ ಏಷ್ಯಾ ಕಲ್ಚರ್ ಸ್ಟಡೀಸ್ ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಪಬ್ಲಿಷ್ ಆಗಿದೆ. ಆಫ್ ಡೆತ್, ರಿಚುವಲ್ಸ್ ಅಂಡ್ ಸಾಂಗ್ಸ್ ಫಾರ್ ದ ಡೆಡ್, ಕೊಡವಾಸ್ ಅಂಡ್ ದೇರ್ ಹಿಸ್ಟೋರಿಕಲ್ ಇಂಟರ್ಸೆಕ್ಷನ್ಸ್ ಅನ್ನೋದು ಜೆಂಡರ್ ಅಂಡ್ ಸೆಕ್ಸುವಾಲಿಟಿ ಇನ್ ಏಷ್ಯಾ ಅಂಡ್ ಪೆಸಿಫಿಕ್ ನಲ್ಲಿ ಪಬ್ಲಿಷ್ ಆಗಿದೆ. ಯೂನಿವರ್ಸಿಟಿ ಆಫ್ ಹೈದರಾಬಾದ್ ಸ್ಟೂಡೆಂಟ್ ಯೂನಿಯನ್ ಎಲೆಕ್ಷನ್ಸ್ 2012 ಅನಾಲಿಸಿಸ್ ಇನ್ ದ ಲೈಟ್ ಆಫ್ ಲಿಂಗ್ಡೋ ಕಮಿಟಿ ರೆಕಮೆಂಡೇಶನ್ ಒಂದು ಸೋಷಿಯಲ್ ಚೇಂಜ್ ಅನ್ನುವ ಪತ್ರಿಕೆಯಲ್ಲಿ ಜರ್ನಲ್ ನಲ್ಲಿ ಪ್ರಕಟ ಆಗಿದೆ. ಸ್ಕ್ರಿಪ್ಟಿಂಗ್ ಲ್ಯಾಂಗ್ವೇಜ್, ಸ್ಕ್ರಿಪ್ಟಿಂಗ್ ಟ್ರಾನ್ಸ್ಲೇಷನ್ ಇನ್ ಟೆಕ್ಸ್ಚುವಲ್ ಟ್ರಾವೆಲ್ಸ್, ಥಿಯರಿ ಅಂಡ್ ಪ್ರಾಕ್ಟೀಸ್ ಆಫ್ ಟ್ರಾನ್ಸ್ಲೇಷನ್ ಇನ್ ಇಂಡಿಯಾ ಅನ್ನುವ ಪ್ರಬಂಧ ಮಿನಿ ಚಂದ್ರನ್ ಮತ್ತು ಸುಚಿತ್ರಾ ಮಾಥುರ್ ಅವರು ಸಂಪಾದನೆ ಮಾಡಿದಂತಹ 2014ರಲ್ಲಿ ಬಂದಿರತಕ್ಕಂತಹ ಕೃತಿಯಲ್ಲಿ ಟೆಕ್ಸ್ಚುವಲ್ ಟ್ರಾವೆಲ್ಸ್, ಥಿಯರಿ ಅಂಡ್ ಪ್ರಾಕ್ಟೀಸ್ ಆಫ್ ಟ್ರಾನ್ಸ್ಲೇಷನ್ ಇನ್ ಇಂಡಿಯಾ ಅಂತಕ್ಕಂಥ ಕೃತಿಯಲ್ಲಿ ರಟ್ಲೆಡ್ಜ್ ನ ಮೂಲಕ ಪಬ್ಲಿಷ್ ಆಗಿದೆ 2014ನಲ್ಲಿ. ಆನ್ ಟೀಚಿಂಗ್ ಸಂಸ್ಕೃತ್ ಅಂಡ್ ಮದರ್ ಟಂಗ್ಸ್ ಅಂತಕ್ಕಂಥ ಒಂದು ಇಂಪಾರ್ಟೆಂಟ್ ಆದ ಪ್ರಬಂಧ EPW ನಲ್ಲಿ 2014ನಲ್ಲಿ ಪಬ್ಲಿಷ್ ಆಗಿದೆ. ಅವರ ಕೊಡವ ಐಡೆಂಟಿಟಿ ಮೇಲೆ ಇರತಕ್ಕಂತಹ ನೇಮಿಂಗ್ ನೇಷನ್ ಅಂಡ್ ನೆಗೋಸಿಯೇಷನ್ ಅಂತಕ್ಕಂಥ ಸುಪ್ರಸಿದ್ಧ ಪ್ರಬಂಧ, ಕೊಡವಾಸ್ ಅಂಡ್ ದೇರ್ ಇಲಿಜಿಬಲ್ ಐಡೆಂಟಿಟೀಸ್ ಅನ್ನುವ ಒಂದು ಪ್ರಬಂಧ. ಕಂಟೆಂಪರರಿ ಸೌತ್ ಏಷ್ಯಾದ 2016 ಎಡಿಷನ್ ನಲ್ಲಿ ಪ್ರಕಟ ಆಗಿದೆ. ವಿಮೆನ್ ಅಂಡ್ ಇಂಗ್ಲಿಷ್ ಎಜುಕೇಶನ್ ಇನ್ ಕೂರ್ಗ್, ಎ ಡಿಸ್ಕಷನ್ ಆಫ್ ಆಲ್ಟರ್ನೇಟಿವ್ ಮಾಡರ್ನಿಟೀಸ್ ಡ್ಯೂರಿಂಗ್ 1834-1882 ಅನ್ನುವ ಪ್ರಬಂಧ, ಇನ್ಫ್ಲುಯೆನ್ಸ್ ಆಫ್ ಇಂಗ್ಲಿಷ್ ಆನ್ ಇಂಡಿಯನ್ ವಿಮೆನ್ ರೈಟರ್ಸ್, ವಾಯ್ಸಸ್ ಫ್ರಮ್ ರೀಜನಲ್ ಲ್ಯಾಂಗ್ವೇಜ್ ಅಂತಕ್ಕಂಥ ಕೆ ಸುನೀತಾ ರಾಣಿಯವರು ಸಂಪಾದನೆ ಮಾಡಿರುವ ಸೇಜ್ ಪ್ರಕಾಶನ ಹೊರತಂದಿರುವ ಕೃತಿಲಿ 2017ರಲ್ಲಿ ಪ್ರಕಟ ಆಗಿದೆ. ಅವರ 3 ಲ್ಯಾಂಗ್ವೇಜಸ್ ಅಂಡ್ ಎ ಬುಕ್ ಅಂತಕ್ಕಂಥ ಇನ್ನೊಂದು ಇಂಪಾರ್ಟೆಂಟ್ ಆದ ಪ್ರಬಂಧ, ರೀತಾ ಕೊತಾರಿ ಅವರು ಎಡಿಟ್ ಮಾಡಿದ ಮಲ್ಟಿಲಿಂಗ್ವಲ್ ನೇಷನ್ ಟ್ರಾನ್ಸ್ಲೇಷನ್ ಅಂಡ್ ಲ್ಯಾಂಗ್ವೇಜ್ ಡೈನಾಮಿಕ್ಸ್ ಇನ್ ಇಂಡಿಯಾ ಅಂತಕ್ಕಂಥ ಆಕ್ಸ್ಫರ್ಡ್ ಯೂನಿವರ್ಸಿಟಿ ಪಬ್ಲಿಷ್ ಮಾಡಿದ ಒಂದು ಸಂಪಾದಿತ ಕೃತಿಯಲ್ಲಿ 2017ರಲ್ಲಿ ಪ್ರಕಟ ಆಗಿದೆ. ಎಂಟ್ರಿ ಫಾರ್ ಕೊಡವ ಅಂತಕ್ಕಂಥ ಇನ್ನೊಂದು ಇಂಪಾರ್ಟೆಂಟ್ ಆದ ಅವರ ಪ್ರಬಂಧ, ಅದು ಲಿಂಗ್ವಿಸ್ಟಿಕ್ಸ್ ಸರ್ವೆ ಆಫ್ ಇಂಡಿಯಾದ ರಾಜೇಶ್ವರಿ ಮಹೇಶ್ವರಯ್ಯ ಮತ್ತು ಪ್ರೊಫೆಸರ್ ಮಹೇಶ್ವರಯ್ಯ ಅವರ ಅಭಿನಂದನಾ ಗ್ರಂಥ. ಇದನ್ನ GN ದೇವಿ ಅವರು ಎಡಿಟ್ ಮಾಡಿದ್ದಾರೆ. ಅದು ಓರಿಯಂಟ್ ಬ್ಲಾಕ್ ಸ್ವ್ಯಾನ್ ಇಂದ 2019ರಲ್ಲಿ ಪಬ್ಲಿಷ್ ಆಗಿದೆ. ಸೊ ಇದಿಷ್ಟು ಅವರ ಮುಖ್ಯವಾದ ಪ್ರಬಂಧಗಳು. ಸೊ ಅವರ ವಿಶೇಷ ನಾನು ಈಗಾಗಲೇ ಹೇಳಿದಾಗೆ ಕೊಡವ ಐಡೆಂಟಿಟಿ ಮತ್ತು ಮೊಬಿಲಿಟಿಯ ಕುರಿತು ಮತ್ತು ಲ್ಯಾಂಗ್ವೇಜ್ ನ ಕುರಿತು ಇಲ್ಲಿ ನೆರೆದಿರತಕ್ಕಂಥ ಬಹುತೇಕ ಆಡಿಯನ್ಸ್ ಅವರ ಬರಹಗಳನ್ನ ಇಂಡಿಯನ್ ಎಕ್ಸ್‌ಪ್ರೆಸ್ ಪತ್ರಿಕೆಯಲ್ಲಿ ಮತ್ತು ಡೆಕ್ಕನ್ ಹೆರಾಲ್ಡ್ ನಲ್ಲಿ ಗಮನಿಸಿರಬಹುದು, ಅಸ್ಮಿತೆಗಳ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ಮತ್ತು ಭಾಷೆಗಳ ಬಗೆಗೆ. ಸೊ ಅಂತಹ ವಿಶೇಷವಾಗಿ ಕೊಡವ ಐಡೆಂಟಿಟಿ ಪಾಲಿಟಿಕ್ಸ್ ನ ಮೇಲೆ ಸಾಕಷ್ಟು ಕಮ್ಯುನಿಟಿಯ ಮೇಲೆ ಸಾಕಷ್ಟು ಕೆಲಸ ಮಾಡಿದ ಕರ್ನಾಟಕದ ಸ್ಕಾಲರ್ ಮತ್ತು ಈಗ ಹೈದರಾಬಾದ್ ನಲ್ಲಿ ಕೆಲಸ ಮಾಡ್ತಾ ಇರ್ತಕ್ಕಂತಹ ಸೌಮ್ಯ ದೇಚಮ್ ಅವರಿಗೆ 3 ಫೋರಂಗಳ ಪರವಾಗಿ ಮತ್ತು ನೆರೆದಿರ್ತಕ್ಕಂತಹ ಎಲ್ಲ ಆಡಿಯನ್ಸ್ ಪರವಾಗಿ ನಾನು ಹೃತ್ಪೂರ್ವಕ ಸ್ವಾಗತವನ್ನ ಕೋರ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದೇನೆ. ವೆಲ್ಕಮ್ ಸೌಮ್ಯ, ಮತ್ತು ತಾವು ತಮ್ಮ ವಿಷಯವನ್ನು ಮಂಡಿಸಬೇಕಂತ ಹೇಳಿ ಕೇಳ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದೀನಿ. ನಮಸ್ಕಾರ, ಸುಸ್ವಾಗತ.
ಥ್ಯಾಂಕ್ ಯು ಪ್ರದೀಪ್. ನಾನು ಪ್ರದೀಪ್ ಹೇಳಿದ್ದೆ ಇಂಟ್ರೊಡಕ್ಷನ್ ಬರೀ ಐ ಟೀಚ್ ಇನ್ ಕಂಪ್ಯಾರಿಟಿವ್ ಲಿಟ್ರೇಚರ್ ಯೂನಿವರ್ಸಿಟಿ ಆಫ್ ಹೈದರಾಬಾದ್ ಅಂತ ಹೇಳಿ ಸಾಕು ಅಂತ. ಆದ್ರೂ ದಿಸ್ ಇಸ್ ದ ಒನ್ ಆಫ್ ದ ಡಿಸ್ಅಡ್ವಾಂಟೇಜಸ್ ಆಫ್ ಸೋಷಿಯಲ್ ಮೀಡಿಯಾ ಆರ್ ಆನ್ಲೈನ್ ಇಂಟರ್ನೆಟ್. ಎಲ್ಲಿಂದಲೋ ನನ್ನ CV ಸಂಪಾದನೆ ಮಾಡಿ ಎಷ್ಟೊಂದು ಓದ್ಬಿಟ್ಟಿದ್ದಾರೆ. ಐ ಆಮ್ ಶ್ಯೂರ್ ಇಲ್ಲಿರೋರೆಲ್ಲ ನನ್ಗಿಂತ ಜಾಸ್ತಿ ಕೆಲಸ ಮಾಡಿದೀರಾ, ನನ್ಗಿಂತ ಜಾಸ್ತಿ ಕರ್ನಾಟಕದ ಸ್ಕಾಲರ್ ಅಂತ ಹೇಳಿದ್ರು ಪ್ರದೀಪ್ ಅವರು. ಬಟ್ ಅದು ತುಂಬಾ ಮುಜುಗರವಾದ ಒಂದು ಲೇಬಲ್. ಐ ಡೋಂಟ್ ನೋ ಆ ಲೇಬಲ್ ನನ್ನ ಕರ್ಕೋಬೋದ ಕರ್ನಾಟಕದ ಸ್ಕಾಲರ್ ಅಂತ, ಅದ್ ನಂಗೆ ತುಂಬಾನೇ ಡೌಟ್. ಅಂಡ್ ಇಲ್ಲಿ ಇರೋರೆಲ್ಲ ನನ್ಗಿಂತ ಜಾಸ್ತಿ ಕೆಲಸ ಮಾಡಿದೀರಾ ಕರ್ನಾಟಕದ ಬಗ್ಗೆ, ಕನ್ನಡದ ಬಗ್ಗೆ. ಸೊ ಐ ಆಮ್ ನಾಟ್ ರಿಯಲಿ sure whether I can be called a scholar of Karnataka, although I have worked on Kodava and Kodava related issues. ಪ್ರದೀಪ್ ಅವ್ರಿಗೂ, ಋತುಮಾನದವ್ರಿಗೂ, ಈ ಆರ್ಗನೈಸರ್ಸ್ ಎಲ್ಲರಿಗೂ ತುಂಬಾನೇ ಥ್ಯಾಂಕ್ಸ್. ಬೇಕಾದಷ್ಟು ಸಲ ನಾನು ಅನ್ಕೋತೀನಿ, ಹೈದರಾಬಾದಲ್ಲಿ ಇದ್ಕೊಂಡು ಒಂದು ಸೆಂಟ್ರಲ್ ಯೂನಿವರ್ಸಿಟಿಲಿ ಇದ್ಕೊಂಡು ಐ ಹ್ಯಾವ್ ರಿಸ್ಟ್ರಿಕ್ಟೆಡ್ ಮೈ ಸೆಲ್ಫ್ ಟು ಕೊಡವ ಸ್ಟಡೀಸ್. ಕನ್ನಡದಿಂದ ಏನೋ ದೂರನೇ ಉಳಿದ್ಬಿಟ್ಟಿದೀನ ಅಂತ ಅನ್ಕೋತೀನಿ. ಒನ್ ಆಫ್ ದ ಕನೆಕ್ಷನ್ಸ್ ಹೂ ಗ್ರೌಂಡ್ ಮೀ ಇಸ್ ಪ್ರೊಫೆಸರ್ ಶಿವರಾಮ್ ಪಡಿಕಲ್. ನನ್ನ ಟೀಚರು ಇಲ್ಲೇ ಕೆಲಸ ಮಾಡ್ತಾರೆ ಈಗ, ಕೊಲೀಗ್. ಹಿ ಇಸ್ ವೆರಿ ಸೀನಿಯರ್. ಹಿ ಗ್ರೌಂಡ್ಸ್ ಮೀ ಇನ್ ಸರ್ಟನ್ ಕೈಂಡ್ ಆಫ್ ಕನ್ನಡ ಡಿಸ್ಕೋರ್ಸಸ್. ಮತ್ತೆ ಈಗ ಪ್ರದೀಪ್ ಅವರು ನನ್ನ ಆಲ್ಮೋಸ್ಟ್ ಎಳ್ದು ತಂದಿದ್ದಾರೆ ಅಂತ ಹೇಳ್ಬೋದು ನಿಮ್ ಜೊತೆ ಮಾತಾಡ್ಲಿಕ್ಕೆ. ಸೊ ಐ ಆಮ್ ವೆರಿ honored. It's my pleasure and honor to talk to all of you and hopefully learn from all of you, and I hope there will be many suggestions and questions on my work. ಈ ಪೇಪರ್ ನಾನು 2018 ಅಲ್ಲಿ ನಿಯಾಸ್ ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಪ್ರೆಸೆಂಟ್ ಮಾಡಿದ್ದೆ. I have worked on it. I am working on it for a book. So book ಚಾಪ್ಟರ್ ಆಗಿ ಕೆಲಸ ಮಾಡ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದೀನಿ. So it's partly presented and I've worked on it. I'm still working on it as a part of a larger book. So there might be gaps and so on. ಅದನ್ನ ನೀವು ನನ್ನ ಗಮನಕ್ಕೆ ತಂದ್ರೆ I'll be really happy. So I'll begin my paper. ನಾನು ಓದ್ತೀನಿ. ಕೆಲವೊಂದು ಸ್ಲೈಡ್ಸ್ ಇದೆ ಮಧ್ಯದಲ್ಲಿ. Otherwise I'll read from what I have written. So this study is an attempt to take a critical relook at the idea of Sanskritization, which for over 70 years has influenced the disciplines of sociology and anthropology, and more importantly, has a huge currency in the contemporary politics of India. It also attempts to see how such notions culled from practices of ethnography are inescapably bound with the language of caste. Drawing from Talal Asad, who is a very well-known established anthropologist, I further argue how the language of caste is enmeshed within the language of inequality. The larger question I hope to address is this: how are certain languages and people associated with non-Hindu practices made less or more modern than others through the frames of language and ethnography? Because the idea of Sanskritization has its roots in the study of Kodavas, I base my arguments on the anthropological texts written on Kodavas by non-Kodava Indians in the mid-20th century. So my initial plan was to understand Sanskritization's implications by using three texts. These three texts are the Coorg Tribes and Castes by L. Ananthakrishna Iyer, published in 1948, D.N. Krishnaya's History of Kodagu, Kodagina Ityasa in Kannada, in 1974, and M.N. Srinivas's Religion and Society Among Coorgs, 1952. The History of Kodagu, I read the Kodava translation of it, and it is just a chronicle of kings who ruled the region and almost written as a tourist guide of Kodagu. L.K. Iyer's book is largely based on the notes of his father and other secondary ethnographic material. And to my knowledge, other than these three books, Krishnaya, Anant Krishnaya, and M.N. Srinivas, there are hardly other writings on Coorg in the early and mid 20th century, and written by non-Kodavas. Right? So both, in fact, Anant Krishna Iyer and Srinivas were writing in the 1940s. Both were anthropologists by profession, and both were quote unquote outsiders to Kodagu and Brahmins of Tamil origin. So there is much in Iyer's text that can be understood from the Orientalist Indologist framework. But as I read Srinivas's text on Coorg for the second time after many years, I was compelled by the need to engage with this work. The reasons are many. I'll come to the reasons in a short while. And I've also felt engaging with Srinivas's ideas is a response to the idea of Sanskritization that at its origin, the idea of Sanskritization has its origin in his work in Kodagu. And he refers to Kodagu as Coorg as it was then known during the colonial times. How this idea of Sanskritization can be seen in juxtaposition to the idea of modern is something that interests me, and to some extent I'll examine here. Indeed, how being modern and how being Sanskritized has much to do with anthropological texts. Using or not using the language of caste will also be my focus. I shall use the term Kodagu and Coorg alternatively. As you know, Coorg is the anglicized term for Kodagu now, which is officially, the district is officially known as Kodagu. Not just because idea of Sanskritization has been appropriated by contemporary politics, but it has been one of the major frameworks to understand caste Hindu Indian society. Most models, most studies that are used to understand caste, whether it is colonialist, nationalist, or Sanskritist, they all produce a consensual imagination of Hindu Indian society. The model of Sanskritization is usually seen as a valid process, despite being a process that limits the people of backward and lower castes to imitators of caste Hindu ritual habits. Until recently, as Christopher Jaffer-Lott writes, the caste system has been analyzed by anthropologists as a sacralized social order based on the notion of ritual purity. The dominant Brahminical values are regarded by the whole society as providing universal references, hence the central role played by the idea of Sanskritization, unquote. Although it is debatable whether whole society considers Brahminical values as universal references, we cannot dismiss Jaffer-Lott's point on how, despite the force of Jyotiba Phule and Ambedkar, who was, in fact, Ambedkar was Srinivasa's contemporary, but of course, um, there is hardly any reference for disciplinary or political for whatever reasons. So, despite Phule and Ambedkar, who avoided the traps of Sanskritization by endowing the lower caste with an alternative value system, and despite Ambedkar having identified the mechanism of Sanskritization and understood their role in maintaining the lower caste in a subservient position, this is Jafar Lott speaking, Srinivasa's Sanskritization has been such a mainstay that there are few studies on caste without a reference to it. Even when you reject the idea of Sanskritization, there is a reference to Sanskritization. So, whether it is in academics or in its larger politics, Sanskritization has been a very, very prominent idea which has been there for last 60, 70 years or so. So the currency it has works in a broad network of social, political, and academic spheres. I want to spend some time elaborating on why responding to Sanskritization is not at all easy. To begin with, I am not a social anthropologist or a sociologist. Disciplines, both these disciplines are defined by a fieldwork based methodology, and in their birth and growth in the last 100 years or so have developed a very strong disciplinary boundary that anyone, especially from a text based discipline like comparative literature, is seen as an intruder, right? Most people, most field based disciplines see textual analysis as not as worthwhile as field based studies. So it's not easy for a comparative comparatist to comment on or to study, critically argue or critically engage with a field based discipline. So, despite now the established notions of ethnography as a text and anthropologist as an author, so now most of us, especially these ideas, come from cultural studies and feminist studies and so on, which see ethnography as a text and anthropologist as an author of such a text, which also implies that literature represents cultural experience in its contextuality, there exists much skepticism about the connections between social science and humanities. Second reason why it is not easy to engage with Sanskritization is because I belong to the community Srinivas studied and Srinivas based his theory of Sanskritization on. So I believe that although this gives me a certain kind of insider's authority, and also it also contests the authority of the anthropologist, there is also a very clear binary of the insider outsider here, and I don't want to fall into that trap. Third reason why working on Sanskritization is not easy because of the current climate in Kodagu, especially in the last 3 decades, and especially the Kodava community, have largely aligned and elected right wing political parties, which uh, propagate the idea of Sanskritization, so to speak. And this is further complicated since many sociologists, including T.K. Uman and Kodava sociologist Veena Punacha, have noted, regardless of the move towards right wing political parties, the socio-cultural landscape of Kodavas retains its non Brahminical or sometimes, which is argued, anti Brahminical practices, be it in questions of gender, ritual, festival, ceremonies, and its everyday practices of food and diet and other rituals. So these things, despite the aligning with right-wing practices, there are very contradictory practices of everyday lives that Kodava practice. Fourth, Kodavas in the last 50 years or so have been a highly mobile community owing to socio-economic changes. Despite, just a second. I'm sorry, page number आ जाएगा. Yeah. Despite the Kodava community in Kodagu being small scale holders of land, most Kodavas have 2 to 10 acres of land. They have been a dominant landholding community within the district of Kodagu, and this is often attributed, whether rightly or wrongly, to their relationship with the British and the subsequent privileges that have come into their way. And this, combined with other aspects, has soured the relationship, the Kodava relationship among other communities of Kodagu. So there are a whole lot of tensions between the dominant Kodavas and the Okaliga Gaudas, which are equally dominant in a certain sense, Arabashe Gaudas, Kodava Mapalas, and not to speak of the tribes, Erava, Kuruba, etc. And also the Kodava relationship with Dalit caste, which is manifest in many dominant ways, is matter for many research yet to come. And fifth reason why working on Sanskritization is not very easy is because the responses of Sanskritization have been so many and the implications to our current political life so immense that it is quite awkward to work on this again and again. You have sociologists from Louis Dumont to Velchuru Narayan Rao to D.L. Sheth to Burton Stein to Veena Punachcha to Kancha Ailaya, all of whom, and these are just the big names, but there are a whole lot of people who, as I said, if they're studying caste Hindu society, the reference to Sanskritization is almost a given. The last but one of the most important reason that complicates this paper is also another contemporary scenario based on petitions from many commoners and also the Coorg National Council, CNC, which is it's known now, but it was known in many different names before. The previous Karnataka government instituted a committee to conduct an ethnographic survey that would determine if Kodavas can be called a tribe, if tribal status could be given to Kodavas based on their practices. So the committee report is expected now, and there are a whole lot of discussions among Kodavas and also among non-Kodavas whether a tribal status is worthy or whether such a dominant community should be given a tribal status, or in what way can this be differentiated from the tribal status of the scheduled tribes and that of the Kodavas. So there is a whole lot of discussions going on around that. But it is quite interesting for me to see how, from being understood as a community that has been Sanskritized, which means imitators of caste Hindu practices, to understand themselves as tribal, right? This is like coming a crooked curve away from Sanskritization. Okay, so Kodavas, as mentioned earlier, so that were the difficulties or the tensions I have within myself when I study a Sanskritization. And Kodavas, as I mentioned earlier, is the community Srinivas studied and based his initial formulation of Sanskritization on. The Karnataka government classifies Kodavas as other backward classes, and Kodagu was under the British rule for a long time. And in 1947, it was a sea state, and in 1956, it merged into what is now called the state of Karnataka. And like all languages, this audience here, like I'm sure agree with me that like all languages, Kodava is also an oral language and is spoken not just spoken by the dominant Kodava community, but also by a number of minority communities in the district of Kodagu. The communities native to Kodagu that speak the Kodava language include Kodavas, what are called Amma Kodavas, Heggades, Panika, Hajama, Airi, Malaya, and also others. And there are also other linguistic minorities in Kodagu, Kodagu Mapilas for one, and also Erava, Better Kuruba, Jain Kuruba, among others. And needless to say, the relationship among the many communities that speak the Kodava language are characterized by many hierarchies. I come to the question of language and ethnography. which I feel is characterized by a problem of subjectivity, right? Who is the subject of ethnography? Although many ethnographers before and around and after M.N. Srinivas have seen language as a practice along similar lines with other sociocultural practices, Srinivas's work unfortunately pays hardly any attention to language. Needless to say, language is definitely a practice which is cultural, a practice which is political as any other practice. Despite arguments to see language as a knowledge system, Despite arguments to see language as a knowledge cultural system, in its written or spoken practice form, the tendency to see language as a medium, worse, not paying attention to it at all, is quite prevalent within the practice of social sciences, especially the practice of ethnography in India. For me, and for most people these days, language is a dynamic practice that has multiple life worlds and multiple possibilities. And I argue for the need to consider knowledge systems that are steeped in every spoken language, a knowledge system that has its own history, literature, whether oral or written, and a language that has a relationship with the local economy, with people's lives and practices, the way they understand the world they inhabit, the relationships with other languages and people around them. So, why does this language question become central to ethnography? Why is it important to see the relationship between ethnography and language, be it colonial ethnography or post colonial ethnography or contemporary ethnographies? Is language essential at all, or are we placing an undue emphasis on the verbal mode of performance? To me, since the ethnographer invariably uses the verbal form, invariably uses the written form of words to represent a community and represents its practices to other communities, and this representation happens in a usually more powerful kind of a language, it becomes imperative that we need to address the language question head on. Both M.N. Srinivas and Talal Asad, who are quite the protagonists in this paper, trained with the Oxford anthropologist Evans Pritchard, who refuted that anthropology belonged to natural science. Evans Pritchard actually saw anthropology as a justifiable part of humanities, especially history. I quote, finding a way to translate one's own thoughts into the world of another culture and thus manage to come to understand it, and then to translate this understanding back as to explain it to the people of one's own culture. So ethnography is all but observing other culture, working with another culture, and writing about it to another culture. So essentially, what Srinivas does is study the Kodwa culture and write about the Kodwa culture in English to another audience altogether. He is not writing it to a Kodwa audience, right? So it is basically translating a community's practices into another language for another audience altogether. So let me come to once this is just a preliminary to say how translation, from the times of Tejaswini Niranjana and Talal Asad, this idea that translation is nothing but representation or representation is nothing but translation has been quite established one. How Sanskritization fits this idea of translation as representation and what does language of inequality do with it is what I am trying to look at. So, what is Sanskritization? Maybe we'll just have a brief look at this uh, quote from Srinivas, right? Uh, is the screen visible?
Yes,
Okay.
yes, Somi, go ahead.
So, as we now know, Srinivas acknowledges that, M.N. Srinivas, the idea of Sanskritization was present in its incipient form in his master's thesis, which then took some shape in his work on Kurds. The idea was further developed in his a note on Sanskritization on Westernization, which was published in 1956. So this is from this quote on Sanskritization is from his book Religion and Society Among the Kurks. It goes like this. The caste system is far from a rigid system in which the position of each component caste is fixed for all the time. Movement has always been possible, and especially so in the middle regions of hierarchy. A low caste was able in a generation or two to rise to a higher position in the hierarchy by adopting vegetarianism and teetotalism and by Sanskritizing its ritual and pantheon. In short, it took over as far as possible the customs, rites, beliefs of the Brahmins, and the adoption of the Brahminic way of life by a low caste seems to have been frequent, although theoretically forbidden. This process has been called Sanskritization in the book, in preference to Brahminization, as certain Vedic rites are confined to Brahmins and the two other twice born castes. If this is a very generalized understanding of the concept, he applies this to Coorg. M.N. Srinivas applies this to Coorg in many ways. And one of the ways is the following quote, which you can see on the screen. In every part of the Kannada country and in Coorg, the Lingayat sect, exclusively of non-Brahmins, have exercised in the past a Sanskritizing influence. Lingayat ritual is Sanskritic, though not Vedic, and the Lingayat Rajas of Coorg have been responsible for the Sanskritization of the customs, manners, and rites of Coorg. This is again from his book, Religion and Society Among the Coorgs. So Srinivas acknowledges that the Sanskritizing influence on the Kodava community has largely can largely be attributed to the Lingayat kings who ruled Coorg from the early 1600s to 1834 when the British took over. For a brief while, Coorg was also under Tipu. Srinivas then proceeds to give some examples varying from temple-based practices to erecting of tombs and others that do not actually, according to me, add much to the argument of Coorg and Sanskritization. Importantly, I note, he says, quote, Lingayatism made headway among Coorgs because it was the religion of the rulers, right? So there is this aspect of power that is very much inherent in this idea and practice of Sanskritization, although Srinivas doesn't use this analysis of power and Sanskritization, he almost makes it a kind of willing practice of Sanskritization, that the subjects took Sanskritization almost willingly, right? Although this quote says otherwise. It was the religion of rulers and therefore it has the power over the ruled. The first thing perhaps for us to discuss is the etymology of this word Sanskritization. Does the word refer to Sanskrit, the language, or Sanskriti, which can have a range of overlapping meanings from religion to culture to civilization? A.M. Shah, in his Sanskritization Revisited, mentions how M.N. Srinivas and the linguist historian Suniti Kumar Chatterjee, and Chatterjee was writing in 1950, Srinivas's book came out in 1952, both of them use the both of them use the term Sanskritization around the same time without being aware of each other's usage. According to A.M. Shah, both Srinivas and Chatterjee use the term largely with reference to language. By this, he means Sanskritization as a concept that was and that is inextricably linked to the religious and cultural complex found in classical Sanskrit literature. It is interesting that Shah, who is writing in 2005, refers to politics of standardization as Sanskritization of languages. Both Sanskrit and Sanskriti suggest an act that brings perfection in matters of culture, language, literature, behavior, and so on, right? Sanskritized. So Samskrita. So it largely refer to how somebody is very cultured, how somebody's culture is very close to perfection, and so on. And it is also, as I said, a commonly used word for refinement, sophistication, and perfection. We also understand that these meanings are not just denotative, they're connotative in many ways. They refer to a whole range of meanings, implied meanings. What is refined culture and what is refined behavior? right? This suggests that the cultures and practices of the upper caste, which are taken to be granted by birth, and this is what Srinivasa's usage clearly meant. By Sanskritization, Srinivas means the adoption of aspects of culture of the upper caste by the lower caste. In particular, it also referred to, as the quote we saw, it refers to vegetarianism, teetotalism, custom, rituals, rites, festival, and pantheons of God, all belonging to the people who posit value to themselves and their practice in the hierarchy of the caste system. Rebutting or refuting Srinivas on factual errors is not at all difficult, because it's quite common knowledge that Kodavas relish meat. They've not taken to vegetarianism at all. And especially the Kodava pork, which is very popular in everyday diet, be it rituals or festivals or anywhere, there is no Kodava function or a ceremony without pork. So the vegetarianism part of Sanskritization is highly questionable. And of course, no teetotalism. No teetotalism. Again, the Kodava love for liquor is quite popular. And also the absence of Brahmin and Brahminical rituals. No, sorry, the absence of Brahmin and Brahminical rituals in festivals, ceremonies, and rites, even today. In the beginning, as I noted, uh, both the TK Uman and Veena Punacha have noted, right, how despite the alignment with the right wing parties, Kodava rituals even today have retained a very non-Brahminical kind of a practice. Uh, I just want to note one practice which I think is very essential to Hindu practice, but the Kodava practice is highly different. This is, I have worked on this elaborately in the paper on death, death and sexuality, the songs for the dead. So this practice where if a man dies, the death rituals, the dead man's wife, dead man's son, dead man's daughter, all of them have equal rights as much as the son does. And so does the husband of a dead woman. If a woman dies, it's the husband of the woman or the daughter of the woman or the son of the woman who have equal rights. Unlike in the very Hindu custom where you need to have a son to fulfill the death rights of the father or the mother. Uh, Most places in Coorg, among the Kodavas, the daughter and the son or the dead man's wife light the pyre together. Remarriage of widows and divorces have been customary, and there are particular names for all these practices. And like many indigenous religions, none of the Kodava folklore or practices refer to any one supernatural being. It is largely the ancestors they invoke in the everyday practice or even in the ceremonies. Of course, today there is a growing uh, a growing attachment with the Hindu gods, but along they exist along with the ancestral kind of a practice. Most of the festivals, as many people have noted, and CNC, the Kodava National Council, often invokes this. How Kodava festivals have been around the agricultural practices of the landholding Kodavas, right? So all these Kodava practices and customs, which are observable, verifiable facts, are strong reasons, as I said, put forward by the Kodava National Council for a tribal status. Whether consciously or not, whether the questions addressed by M.N. Srinivasa's work, whether they refer to these practices, we have no clue why Srinivas hardly mentions the meat eating practices or the ancestral practice or other practices that can possibly question this idea of Sanskritization. So Srinivasa's account, basically what I argue, is a selective account of Kodava practices that justified his idea of Sanskritization. Right? Just an example of pork eating might have reversed, because most outsiders today, even in Hyderabad recently, I found that there's an online portal that sells Kodava pork curry, and it is run by a Telugu caste man. So it's it almost looks like there is a Kodavaization, at least in the practice of pork eating, if not in other practices, which is I have borrowed this from the Dalitization of Kancha Ilaya. But then, if such kind of a reverse Sanskritization happens or Kodavaization happens in relation to pork eating, it can essentially question Sanskritization, and therefore I argue that Srinivas kept certain select practices outside his study. And these factual errors also lead us to ask methodological questions. That the notion of dominant caste was elaborated by Srinivas based on his fieldwork on Rampura years after he had worked in Coorg is another problem with this method and with this way of drawing conclusions. I quote from Srinivas. In fact, my major fieldwork, namely in Coorg, was severely affected by my coming down with a serious abdominal ailment during the first few weeks of my stay in Merkara. I took months to recover and had to abandon the ideas I had entertained of spending several months in a Coorg village. I got a chance to experience field research only in 1948 when I spent over 10 months in Rampura, a village 22 miles from Mysore. This is not to slight the otherwise innovative and path breaking work Srinivas did and is rightly acknowledged for. The questions I have are these. If Srinivas was unable to carry the intense fieldwork of months, how and where did he get all his material on Coorg, based on which he wrote a full length book that is now canonized in sociology and anthropology? In which language did he speak to his subjects? Obviously, Srinivas did not speak Kodava, and Kodavas learned Kannada in school. And in 1940s, this percentage of Kodavas who learned Kannada, a kind of formal Kannada in schools, would have been very less. And that too, in a language that can respond to an anthropologist, is hard to imagine. Same is true with English, that Srinivas acknowledges Sri Tirumalachar for hospitality in Markara, suggests that he stayed with someone, he shared a communal space, and he did not stay with Kodavas. So, what kind of language then did the few educated Kodavas in 1940s he kept in touch with use? What kind of questions were asked? Did Kannada, a language with a caste memory, unlike Kodava, frame the responses within the caste framework? Or did Srinivas, in the process of translation to English, translate all these into the language of caste? How did Srinivas's material justify his idea of Sanskritization that was already present in his master thesis? In 1939, writing much ahead of Srinivas, Margaret Mead, another known anthropologist, argued that the ethnographer, following Malinowskian prescription to avoid interpreters and to conduct research in the vernacular, did not, in fact, need to attain a virtuosity in native tongues. An ethnographer need not be very proficient in the native tongue, but they should be able to use the vernacular to ask questions, maintain rapport, and generally get along in the culture while obtaining good research results in particular areas of concentration. And if for Margaret Mead, a limited usage of language was sufficient, language was not central, but it was sufficient, right? It was a minimum usage was of language was required. Evans Pritchard, with whom actually Srinivas trained, on the other hand, never dissociated the concern of language from the concern of ethnography. For Srinivas, it was neither language nor practice. It was a narrative listened to in English from a very privileged, educated informants who told him what he wanted to listen. I also have this argument, but I can't justify this because I don't know to whom Srinivas spoke to. So when you are spoken to, you are asked questions by a Brahmin anthropologist who is trained in Oxford, and you're asked questions about your practices, about purity, about impurity, and so on and so forth. And the few educated Kodavas whom he spoke to, I think, did not want to be seen as quote unquote impure than the Brahmin. They did not want their religion to be seen as lesser than that of the Brahmin, and gave the answers that the anthropologists sought. So there is a kind of any informant, basically the agency of the subject works here, and it is quite a manipulative answer which was sought and which was got by M.N. Srinivas. So, what were the questions asked? How were they framed? To whom they were addressed? We have no clues about them in Srinivas's book. And what ethnography often masks is the voice with which it carries its interpretation. Also, ethnography seldom attributes its voice to the individual, although most ethnographers, especially here, M.N. Srinivas spoke to few individuals. It attributes the voice and interpretation to the whole of the community and not to the individual. So the interpretation of the ethnography is always generalized at the cultural level to that of the community and beyond. You can see how Sanskritization as an idea came up with interacting with some Kodavas, then it is attributed to the whole community, and now Sanskritization has become a term that is attributed to a whole lot of communities across India, right? So ethnography, although it might be done at the individual level, is attributed at a much large, generalized at a much larger level. So the Coots or the Kodava's idea of kinship, religion, upward mobility, generalized from the words of a couple of English and Kannada speaking Kodava friends during Srinivas's few weeks of stay in Markara, becomes the objective truth of Srinivas's ethnography that further lays claim to the biggest marker of change in the caste society through the idea of Sanskritization. This, as Roy Wagner has argued, is nothing less than the invention of culture, its activity being plural and beyond anybody's control. For once, I find Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak quite useful here. Spivak, who is a comparatist, but has in the last 1 decade or so, has argued for a whole lot of interdisciplinary crossing of boundaries in her own words. I quote Spivak, who talks about fieldwork and language. We need to work to make the traditional linguistic sophistication of comparative literature supplement area studies, supplement history, anthropology, political theory, and sociology, right? By approaching the language of the other not as a field language. Indeed, I'm inviting the kind of language training that would disclose the irreducible hybridity of all languages. So, for the social scientists, language shouldn't remain just a just a media for a field work, but it should actually enable the social scientists to explore the hybridity that is inbuilt in all languages. And Spivak further argues for considering languages as active cultural media rather than objects of study by the sanctioned ignorance of the metropolitan migrant like many of us. As mentioned in the beginning of this paper, during the times in which Srinivas was conducting during the times in which Srinivas was conducting his fieldwork and writing, the question of language did figure in anthropology. Indeed, as Talalasad points out, as early as 1954, George Linhart saw notions of translation as central to the task of social anthropology. I quote from Linhart: the problem of describing to others how members of a remote tribe think then begins to appear largely as one of translation, of making the coherence of primitive thought that is inherent in languages it really lives in as clearly as possible in our own language, unquote. So what Srinivas seems to have done is exactly the opposite. The coherence that Kodavas had in their thought and practice was translated into a coherence that defined Hindu caste system and not the Kodava system, right? So there is a particular cultural practice, there is a particular way of life which, when translated into English, assumes another kind of coherence. And this coherence, I argue, is a very caste Hindu coherence. So again, I have another comparatist in mind who says, this is Lucia Boldrini, translation then is inseparably connected to a civilizing mission, the bearing of Christianity and Western letters to the barbarian. Literally, as we have noted, those who do not speak the language of the empire. From its beginnings, the imperialist mission is, in short, one of translation, the translation of the other into the terms of the empire. So, what ethnography has done is essentially this: translate the other, translate somebody who is different from you into your own language, into the terms of the empire. Christianity here will have to be substituted by Hinduism, and it makes perfect sense as to why the Brahmin anthropologists found very perfect reason in civilizing the different, if not barbaric, Kodavas. Srinivas also acknowledges works of Mogling, Richard, Madikerianda Chinnappa, and M.B. Emanu, who, along with others, had worked on Coorg. These and others, almost all of them colonial administrators, missionaries, have referred to Kodavas as a peculiar race, as a community, as a tribe, and so on and so forth. Very rarely have these colonial writings have described Kodavas in caste-based terms like Srinivas done. In fact, I've been recently reading Pratama Banerjee, Ajay Skaria, and others who argue that this difference between the categories of caste and tribe is a very colonial kind of a distinction, and there were no clear distinction between what can be called as a caste or what can be called as a tribe, and so on and so forth. But these categories were just in the making and got crystallized during colonial times and also in the times of Srinivas and so on. But the problem with Srinivas is that Srinivas used these terms of caste in describing communities where perhaps caste practices were very different or non existent. So, in his book, this Religion and Community and Caste, when describing certain events and rituals, Srinivas uses the term high caste okka and low caste okka. Right? Okka in Kodava refers to clan. That's the term, Kodava term for clan, or what is popularly known as the family name. And till date, the Kodava community is structured in exogamous clans that are called Okka. The idea of caste among the clans is non existent, or I am not aware of that. And there is no equivalent term for high caste Okka and low caste Okka. These are the terms that Srinivas uses in English, right? What is a high caste Okka? What is a low caste Okka? There is no explanation in Srinivas, or there are no equivalents in the uh, Kodava language. All clans are same among the Kodavas, and none are above the other. Of course, in the recent times and in the association with Lingayat kings and the British, have made some individuals in some Okkas richer than the other. But then clans can be huge. There are big clans, there are small clans, and class mobility is based on individual families and not based on Okka. So you can have a very rich person belonging to the Chattai and the Bada clan, let us say, that's the my clan, or there might be a very a poor person belonging to the same clan as I do. So there is no possibility of understanding any clan as a high caste clan or a low caste clan. And as I said, there are no explanation of these terms in Srinivas's work, and definitely not in the observable practice of Kodavas. So what is the function of caste in such a context? And there are even many other examples also, the way Srinivas uses the terms muddy and pole. Now, most Kannada speakers would know what muddy is, right? A certain caste-based purity or cleanliness that muddy refers to. And in Kodava, as I grew up or as I observe others, and after reading Srinivas, something which I've observed even more closely, it's a term which is rarely used, right? And then, as I said, in Kannada, it is used in the frame of purity connected to caste and practices that are associated with bath, food, clothes, eating, and so on. And much less than muddy because pole, the other word pole, which is suggesting impurity, that is even less used. And these words suggest similar meaning. There are many other uh, words that Srinivas could have used, but he chooses to use muddy and pole, connects it with the caste framework rather than anything else, right? So Srinivas seems to have done is this, is to import these words from Kannada, although his home language was Tamil, he directly used these languages into the Kodava practices. He translated them into Kodava and he translated the Kodava practices into Kannada within the framework of caste. Uh, So then, using the caste-based terms and turning these concepts as Sanskritization, Srinivas uses the language of caste to understand something that perhaps is outside of caste. By using Sanskrit and Sanskriti, the language and culture of the caste elite, irrespective of its irrelevance in the context of Kodagu, he not only framed the question of change in society in terms of lower caste aspiration to move up in the hierarchy, but also set the model for aspiration as the culture of higher caste. This not only brought communities like Kodavas into the structure of caste, but reinforced the language and ideology of inequality, is what I want to bring forth here. To bring in the language of caste also means bringing in a structural inequality. One should grant it to Srinivas, who in 1955, in another work, he said, occasionally a group of originally out, sorry, I quote, occasionally a group originally outside the Hindu fold, such as the Kurds, may become dominant by virtue of numbers, wealth, or martial prowess. What does this mean to understand a group outside the Hindu fold from a caste perspective in terms of purity and pollution? I quote, and this is from Ailaya. In order to Brahminize the Dalit Bahujan elite, this school of sociologists constructed a theory of Sanskritization that virtually appealed to the Brahmin Banya civil society to open its doors to Brahminize or co opt the Dalit Bahujan elite, so that the historical danger of destabilizing the Brahminical caste could be revealed. Not just this, Sanskritization very subtly set up vegetarianism as a culturally superior norm. Ritual life was defined in terms of Hindu gods, goddesses, meat eating, which was all described as inferior. The Sanskritization theory of purity pollution, therefore constructed by Brahminical sociologists and anthropologists, provided legitimacy to this form of modern Brahminism in the academic sphere. Unquote. So essentially, what Ailaya is saying is one, all the practices of the lower castes or backward castes or other castes were described as inferior, and there are certain communities, especially the Dalit Bahujan elites, who potentially could destabilize Brahminical practices. Such practices were co-opted into what was called Sanskritization. So the next section is titled Kodava as modernity and westernization versus Sanskritization. So in her critique of Sanskritization, Veena Punacha notes how Srinivas's book represents an account that is frozen in time at a critical juncture of colonial and post-colonial transformation, which in turn represents the culture of Kodavas as static, while there were a whole lot of things that might have needed attention. At a time when colonial court's relationship with British was rewarded in many ways, Srinivas's whole book doesn't seem to see it as worthy of contextualizing. So there's Srinivas's work doesn't refer to any kind of relationship between the Kodavas and the British, right, which resulted in a whole lot of changes in the society. So that kind of a change, while it was actively in practice during Srinivas's time, doesn't get any mention. So it's Srinivas's account is kind of frozen, is what Punacha is arguing. In effect, it seems to elide this history altogether in the anxiety of portraying a Sanskritized culture. So once you talk about the westernizing influence of the British, it will actually question the Sanskritizing practice, right? So perhaps Srinivas doesn't want to put in these two contradictions together, westernizing influence and the Sanskritizing influence. P.K. Uman, I quote, who says this: although the Kurds were more westernized than the Mysore Brahmins, when Srinivas was doing his fieldwork, he failed to observe this phenomenon. And in spite of the fact that Kurds were more westernized than the Mysore Brahmins, Srinivas found that they were eager to Sanskritize. This woman says is a very sequential determinism, right? It's a linear model of mobility that has three stages. So any community in Srinivas's theory will go through three stages of mobility. There is a pre-Sanskritization, there is a Sanskritization, and a westernization. So, and this westernization actually is enabled by the Brahmins who are westernizing. So this sequential determinism means you already determine which direction in which the community is moving. So from a pre-Sanskritic stage, you come to a Sanskritic stage and then you enter into westernization stage. So the possibility of any community skipping Sanskritization altogether and then embracing westernization, thereby asserting a dignity which is very difficult within a rigid caste structure, doesn't figure in this sequential deterministic Sanskritization. So in his revised note of Sanskritization, Srinivas, to his credit, he notes, while the westernization of the Brahmins enabled the entire Hindu society to westernize, the Brahmins themselves found some aspects of westernization, such as diet, freedom, dress, freedom from pollution, difficult to accept. Perhaps another caste should not have found them so difficult. The cooks, for instance, took quite easily to British diet and dress and certain activities like dancing, hunting, and sports. One thing I want you all to note is for Srinivas, it is the Brahmins who enabled the entire Hindu society to westernize, right? There is hardly any agency to the non-Brahmin caste to westernize themselves, right? They are either, they're almost always blind imitators of the caste Hindu practice. They have no choice to directly embrace westernization. It is through the Brahmins who enable them to westernize. And you should also note that when he says the cooks, for instance, took easily to British diet and dress. That diet, dancing, hunting were part of perhaps pre-British Kodava system, or many, or also actually part of most people who live in areas like Kodagu. This Srinivas chooses to miss. And Kanchailaya is right on the nail when he notes that, though, I quote Ilaya, though Hindu nationalist modernity was constructed with reference to European, particularly British practices of modernity, the indigenous sources of modernity that were rooted in Dalit Bahujan productive and proto-scientific processes were never examined as science of soil and never examined as modern, right? Modern is only enabled by the Brahmin. So Ilaya argues how the so-called modern practices of the nationalists that sought to reform upper caste practices, especially regarding women, were already present among Dalit Bahujans. Indeed, among Kodavas, as I pointed out, widow remarriage, divorcee remarriage is crystallized as customs and are named and have rituals around them. And as also pointed out, whether in practices of food or gender or daily life, there are a whole lot of practices that does not neatly fit into the Brahminic structure of Hindu tradition. So then, instead of seeing these many practices and other practices as modern or Western, Srinivas chooses Sanskritization. This, in M.S.S. Pandyan's words, an essay which I very much like and often teach, is one step outside modernity, right? A phrase that is quite useful in understanding Kodavas as modern and modern prior to the engagement with the British. Through an analysis of various literary texts, both by the upper caste and by the lowered caste, MSS Pandyan argues for the need to re-signify as positive those cultural practices which are deemed by the upper caste as lowly, be it diet or any other practice. This contradictory engagement with modernity by the lowered caste has an important message for all of us. Quote Pandyan, that is, by being one step outside modernity alone can guarantee a public where the politics of difference can articulate itself, and being one step outside modernity is indeed being one step ahead of modernity. Unquote. How being one step ahead of modernity is channelized through the Kodava tradition and later through English is considered an undesirable modern by the Sanskritized modern. So, in fact, being closer to English or having certain practices that are considered non Brahminic but modern, these are undesirable modern, right? For the Sanskritized modern, there are certain practices that are undesirably modern. But these practices may be considered desirably modern by the Kodavas themselves, is something which we need to look into in detail somewhere else. This is the last section of this paper. So it's called Language of Caste and Language of Inequality. Although I have hinted how the practices of any community that are framed in the language of caste inherently structures it around inequality. This is some kind of conclusionary note to that hint of argument. I use James Clifford here, who has written a lot on the authority of ethnography itself. So, James Clifford, ethnography produces cultural interpretations through intense research experience. How is then ethnography's unruly experience transformed into an authoritative written account? Right? Ethnography is not neat. When you study a community, there are whole lot of contradictions, there are a whole lot of complexities involved. So, how is this unruly experience? How is it neatly written into a very authoritative account? Religion and Society Among Cooks is a very authoritative account that is studied, that is quoted, that is used in many ways. So, how is a whole lot of complex phenomena become so authoritative? How precisely is a garrulous, overdetermined, cross cultural encounter shot through with power relations and personal cross purposes, circumcised as an adequate version of more or less discrete other world, composed by an individual author? This writing includes minimally a translation of experience into the textual form. So, something that the ethnographer listens to, something that the ethnographer observes, is translated into a textual written form. This involves multiple subjectivities and political constraints beyond the control of the writer. In response to these forces, ethnographic writing enacts a specific strategy of writing. So, this specific strategy of writing is what the language of inequality is what I argue. So, it is these strategies of writing that leads to inequality of languages on which Kalalasa bases his argument on. And according to Asad, the anthropologist, from his or her practices of ethnography, has to test the tolerance of his or her language, his or her own practices for assuming unaccustomed forms. What sorry, what Asad is saying is that instead of framing another society, instead of translating another society in the language of the anthropologist, usually in English, in a certain format, you should allow the practices of the community you study to transform yourself, right? Instead of seeing the society as transforming like the way you desire, you see, you reflect on your own practices, and ethnography should allow you to reflect on your own language and your own practices. So, as we saw in the case of Srinivas, the test was for the language and people he studied. The touchstone for the test was the universal language of caste, a language culture Srinivas was part of. We try to represent the people we study and their conceptions systematically in the logical constructions we have been brought up to use, and we hope at best to reconcile what can be expressed in their languages with what can be expressed in ours. Right? So, what they speak, what they practice in their own language, we hope at best to express it in our own language. We mediate between their habits of thought, which we have acquired with them, and with those of our own society. In doing so, it is not finally some mysterious, exotic philosophy that we are exploring, but further potentialities of our own language and thought. So, what ethnography should ideally do is explore the potentiality of our own thought and practice, and not explore some mysterious, exotic philosophy. By this, I understand the anthropologist as being open to transformation of his or her language, his or her own society. Because the authority of the anthropologist is so rooted in the powers of casteist language, academics encourages the tendency to read the implicit in alien cultures. The tendency by training is not to see the powers and authority at work, not to allow one's own language and thought to transform. The tendency of the anthropologist is always to see how one's worldview can transform the people who you are studying. So it is the anthropologist who creates meanings via translation, meanings for the people who are the objects of his or her own studies. The cultural, therefore, I quote Asad, the process of cultural translation representing another community is inevitably enmeshed in conditions of power, be it professional, national, international. And among these conditions is the authority of ethnographers to uncover implicit meanings in subordinate society. Given this, the interesting question for enquiry is how power enters the process of cultural translation. So, by providing the logic of Sanskritization where very little existed, Srinivas is guilty by being excessively charitable of providing a caste sense where perhaps it did not exist. Instead of explaining the non Hindu practices, which many of us see as a more egalitarian practice, Srinivas provides the cooks with the logic of caste Hindu mentality. More importantly, by not taking into account the logic of Kodava discourse and its complex engagement with the British modern, Srinivas inserted the language of caste, a language that spoke to Hindu India, Pan India as he called it. Instead of allowing the field to change the inequalities that he brought from his own social location, he allowed it to frame the Kodava. To see Kodava as already modern or perhaps more modern, skipping Sanskritization would mean to destabilize the logic of caste, a proposition that was perhaps undesirable. For Talal Asad, ethnography is on shaky ground precisely because it is meant to be for another audience in a language that is usually inaccessible to the people it describes. Right? So you study a people and write about them in another language. So the people whom you study cannot usually, rarely, never read an account of themselves written by the anthropologists. It's only later that perhaps in an ideal situation, as another anthropologist put it, in an ideal situation that the people who are studied can actually question what is being written about them. And ethnography can stand tall only when it can be called by the people who are its objects. The process has only begun, and I will end this paper with a personal anecdote, which for me has been the best critique of Sanskritization and endorsement of a certain kind of Kodava modern. When I first read this paper in NIAS in Bangalore, I had visited my father in Coorg. He has been in Coorg all his life, and we were chatting, and he was telling me about the village gossip. Just the previous year, in my village, the Tulu Brahmin had committed suicide for various reasons. So my father told me that his widow, his wife, had remarried, uh, and it was very rare that Brahmin women even today remarried, but she had remarried, and my father was sharing this gossip with me. So I said, yeah, it's nice, and it's good that she found somebody to marry. And my father said in Kodava, ikkik pattamalu modern ayanundu. Right? These days, Brahmins are also getting to be modern. So with that, I'll end my talk. I hope I made some sense, and I hope there'll be many things to discuss further from your questions. Thank you very much. Thank you, Pradeep, and thank you, everyone. Yes.
Thank you, Soumya, for a beautiful lecture. Now it's the time for question and answer. First question I'm taking from Professor N. Manu Chakravarti. Is a retired professor in NMKRV College, Bengaluru. Talking to many Kodava friends, for over 4 decades and over many endearing meetings, who are quite affluent and have done well in life, I cannot understand their rather bitter communal feeling towards Muslims. Especially these friends are quite westernized in their ways. I am distressed that they uncritically align themselves with Hindutva forces and have no problems with so-called Brahminical practices. Could you reflect on these disturbing tendencies?
Uh, I think there are two questions here, Professor Chakravarti. One is they're very the Kodava hatred for the Muslim. The other is uncritical acceptance of Brahminical practices, which I would separate these two things, right? For many decades now, I think one of the reasons for this hatred for Muslims is, as you all would understand and aware of, is the history of Tipu Sultan and the way it has been told and retold within the Kodava communal spaces. So this history of Tipu Sultan, I think, uh, has been narrated in such a manner, and given the current political climate, it has been reinforced so much that I have no words, but it is sad. It's a sad truth. But I also don't think there is an uncritical acceptance of Brahminical practice. I think people are quite aware, although there are certain uh, sections that do align themselves with Brahminical practices, but people do, like for example, when if somebody wishes, there's a cousin who back home, there are cousins who last I was home during October, somebody wished a cousin happy Ayudha Puja. So this cousin replied, who runs a small shop in Gonikoppa. He replied, I am a Kodava, right? I don't practice Ayudha Puja. So there are a whole lot of commoners like this too, who have a very different engagement with Hindu practices. So I think these two things are different. Um, but this hatred, I have no words for, and there are ways in which some of us engage within our own community, within social media, within our own families, but it is quite I think it's not just restricted to Kodava, but also a larger phenomena. But yeah, it is sadly present. Can you give me 1 minute? I need to use the washroom. Pradeep, I'll get back in 1 minute.
Hello. Hello. Yeah. Second question by some unknown audience. He's asking that it is very much appreciative that Kodava rituals and cultures are entirely different and non-Vedic. But isn't it ironic that they cling on to Hindu when it is referred religion? Hello?
प्रदीप
Some
ಮೇಡಮ್
can.
ಒಂದು ನಿಮಿಷ
Okay.
ಬರ್ತಾರೆ.
Yeah, sorry, Pradeep. Yeah.
Okay. There is a question from unknown audience. Uh, it is very much appreciative that Kodava rituals and cultures are entirely different and non-Vedic. But isn't it ironic that they cling on to Hindu when it is referred religion?
Yeah, that is right, but I think there are a whole lot of factors there. How and when communities are officially categorized, right? When you find a community, it's not just my argument. There are many people who worked on other backward classes have pointed this out. How are communities categorized into OBCs? So when you find a community neither has practices of the upper caste and they're not a lower caste, they're not quote unquote untouchables, and when communities are not either Muslim or Christian or are not upper caste, then it becomes very convenient to bracket these communities as OBCs, other backward castes. And this kind of a categorization officially has also led to a certain Hinduist kind of a framework for all these communities, right? And this is one of the arguments that how non-Hindus are inserted into the Hindu caste structure by such official categories. But other than the official categorization, which is a practice since colonial times, census, and so on and so forth, there is also this, I think, a very nationalist kind of a ideology that since the colonial times that has been very prevalent, right? So in this nationalist imagination, identity that is very um, very anti-colonial was desirable. So what is this anti-colonial ideology that suited the nationalist ideology is the Hindu identity. So an Hindu identity which gave a certain kind of assertion was kind of, if not imposed, was made a very umbrella kind of an identity to all the communities, which then communities took over, right? There is this official kind of a ideology or official kind of a categorization. Then there is this national identity, national ideology, nationalist ideology through which Hindu identity becomes umbrella identity. And then, of course, in today's Islamophobic world, you have a anti-Muslim stand to which Hindu identity very easily speaks to. So there are a whole lot of things that makes Kodava easily identifiable with a Hindu despite their practices.
Question from Mahabala Yedur. What is the origin of Kodava ethnic group? From where and when they migrated to present Kodagu and settled here?
I don't know this, but I also don't think Kodavas migrated. Or my favorite answer to this is also every human being has migrated from Africa, right? So human Homo sapiens are all migrants. They're all beings that who have migrated from Africa and settled in various parts of the world. So I don't think it is specific to Kodava. Migration is part of human history, and there is no historical or scientific study that can prove as Kodavas as very different or who have come to Kodagu recently. They have been in Kodagu since I don't know when, so have the other communities in Kodagu. So this migration theory is, I don't buy it basically.
Question from Seema Murira that are Kodavas a separate race or they are a community?
Again, the same reply like the previous one. Separate race. No, it's not a separate race, and the question is also what is a separate race, right? It's a huge question. Who are separate race? No, Kodavas are very much part of the subcontinent, right? So there is no separate race question at all here. It is a separate community, like many other separate communities in India. Distinct communities. Yeah.
Amar Holegadde posted a question in Facebook Live so how legitimate is the concept of Sanskritization, and how do we understand the shift to Vedic gods among tribes in anthropological perspective?
Yeah, I think I answered this two questions before. One has to look into the colonial classification of categories. One has to look into nationalist ideologies, and one has to also look at contemporary dominant ideologies. Right. One of the problems I find within anthropology and also within the political categorization of communities is how it doesn't identify smaller religions, basically indigenous tribal religions. Religions are understood as largely organized religions that have a larger structure, right? Beyond a particular locale, beyond a particular region. So, in this understanding of an organized structure within a certain hierarchy, the smaller religions of the tribes are not counted as religions and therefore included in the dominant religions of the surroundings. It may be Hinduism. It's largely Hinduism in India, where tribes are associated with Hindus. Although, if unless many tribes convert into Christianity, you are associated with Hindus. I mean, this is also true of Native Americans in America, right? So, but many of them have accepted Christianity, but many of them have retained their own indigenous religion. But instead of understanding indigenous religion, official and political categorization often makes it impossible for smaller religions to assert themselves, to identify themselves. So I think anthropology does look into smaller religions, but the pressures of contemporary ideologies are quite strong, as you know, and therefore, if not a shift to Vedic gods, there is a certain conversion, if you want to say, towards the dominant religion.
Jyoti Jaiprakash has a question that with the gradual but definite shift towards a right-wing affiliation, do you see the Kodavas eventually following a Srinivas version of Sanskritization?
I think it is much more complex. There are certain practices that may not be Sanskritized, that may not be Brahminical, but it may be, you know, a modified version of a practice or a ritual. But it is, one cannot see any community for that matter. Even when you study Brahmins, you can't study them based only on their tradition, right? They are professors, they are IAS officers, they are this, they are that. So one has to see the Kodava community in a whole network of practices. There is a overlapping of the local agricultural dominant feudal kind of a community, which is combined with a certain version of Brahminical rituals. It is also combined with certain formal education that has made them quite westernized, and there are whole lot of identities that are parallel, that are complex, that are contradicting, that pull the community in different directions. So I don't see Kodavas as Sanskritizing, whether now or then. I see it as a complex identity, just like any other community should be seen as made up of a whole lot of discourses, not just of one way of one linear way of looking at identity, but a complex way of looking at identity.
Shafiq from Madikeri has a question. Kodavara ವೇಷಭೂಷಣಗಳು ಮತ್ತು ಕುರ್ದಿಶ್ ವರ್ಗದವರ ಟ್ರೆಡಿಷನಲ್ ವೇಷಭೂಷಣಗಳು ಒಂದೇ ರೀತಿ ಕಾಣುತ್ತಿದ್ದು ಕುರ್ದಿಶ್ ವರ್ಗದವರ ಸಂಸ್ಕೃತಿಯನ್ನು ಕೊಡವರು ಒಳಗೊಂಡಿದ್ದರು ಎಂದು ಹೇಳಬಹುದೇ?
There are a lot of videos, photos, and of course writing circulated. One Kurdish, Yemeni, Jordan. So a lot of connections made, especially around the dressing and looks of Kodavas with the Middle West Asian communities. But yeah, it is interesting, but I haven't studied them, so I don't know. It's not just Kurdish, as I said. There are a whole lot of other communities which are connected like this based on dress and other things, but one has to study more before making any connection. And there's a question here. You're right, Kodavas migrated from Africa. Their antiquity goes back to megalithic age. I didn't just mention Kodavas migrated from Africa. I said the whole of Homo sapiens, all of us migrated from Africa at some point of time and have been migrating. The history of human beings is a history of migration. So it's not just Kodavas. All of us came out of Africa.
ಬಹುತೇಕ ಪ್ರಶ್ನೆಗಳು ಮುಗ್ದಿದೆ. ಯಾರಿಗೆ ಮೌಖಿಕವಾಗಿ ಓರಲ್ಲಿ ಮಾತಾಡಬೇಕು, ಪ್ರಶ್ನೆ ಕೇಳಬೇಕು ಅನ್ಸುತ್ತೆ, ಅವರು ತಮ್ಮನ್ನು ಅನ್ಮ್ಯೂಟ್ ಮಾಡಿಕೊಂಡು ಪ್ರಶ್ನೆಗಳನ್ನು ಕೇಳಬಹುದು, ದಯವಿಟ್ಟು. ಪ್ರೊಫೆಸರ್ ದತ್ತಾತ್ರೇಯ, ಪ್ರೊಫೆಸರ್ ಟಿ.ಪಿ. ವಿಜಯ್ ಅವರು ಮತ್ತು ಅನೇಕ ವಿದ್ವಾಂಸರು ಕೊಡಗಿನ ಮೇಲೆ ಕೆಲಸ ಮಾಡಿರೋರು, ಯಾರಿಗೆ ಯಾರ ಪ್ರಶ್ನೆ ಇದೆ ಕೇಳಬಹುದು, ದಯವಿಟ್ಟು ಅನ್ಮ್ಯೂಟ್ ಮಾಡ್ಕೊಳ್ಳಿ, ಪ್ರಶ್ನೆ ಕೇಳಿ.
ಮೇಡಮ್ ನಮಸ್ಕಾರ.
ನಮಸ್ಕಾರ. ಯಾರು?
ಪ್ರೊಫೆಸರ್ ಮುರುಗೇಶ್ ಅಂತೇಳಿ, ಉಡುಪಿಯಿಂದ.
ನಮಸ್ಕಾರ ಸರ್.
ನಾನು ಹೇಳಿದ್ದು ಕೊಡವ ಅಂತಂದೇಳಿ ಅರ್ಥ, ಕೊಡವು ಸೇರಿದಂತೆ ಇಡೀ ದಕ್ಷಿಣ ಭಾರತ ದ್ರಾವಿಡ ಜನಾಂಗದವರು ಆಫ್ರಿಕಾ ಮೂಲದವರು ಅನ್ನೋ ಅರ್ಥದಲ್ಲಿ ನಾನು ಹೇಳಿದ್ದು.
ಓಕೆ.
ಮತ್ತು ನಾನು ಈಗ ಕೂರ್ಗಿನಲ್ಲಿ ಏನು ಕೆಲಸವನ್ನ ಮಾಡಿದ್ದೇನೆ ಮತ್ತು ಮಾಡ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದೇನೆ, ಅವರ ಆಂಟಿಕ್ವಿಟೀಸ್ ನನಗೆ ಮೆಗಾಲಿಥಿಕ್ ಗಿಂತನೂ ಹಿಂದಿನ ಯಾವುದೇ ಎವಿಡೆನ್ಸ್ ಇದುವರೆಗೂ ಸಿಗ್ಲಿಲ್ಲ.
ಓಕೆ.
ಮೆಗಾಲಿಥಿಕ್ ಕಲ್ಚರ್ಗೆ ಸಂಬಂಧಪಟ್ಟ ಹಾಗೆ ಕೂರ್ಗಿನಲ್ಲಿ ಬಹಳಷ್ಟು ಸಾವಿರಾರು ನಮಗೆ ಅಲ್ಲಿನ ಬೃಹಶಿಲಾಗಿ ಸಂಸ್ಕೃತಿಗೆ ಸಂಬಂಧಪಟ್ಟಂತಹ ಅವಶೇಷಗಳು ಮತ್ತೆ ಸಮಾಧಿಗಳು ನಮಗೆ ದೊರೆತಿದ್ದಾವೆ. ಅವುಗಳ ಮೇಲೆ ಸಾಕಷ್ಟು ಅಧ್ಯಯನ ಕೂಡ ಆಗಿದೆ. ಹಾಗಾಗಿ ಹೆಚ್ಚಂತ ಹೇಳಿದ್ರೆ ಕೊಡವ ಆಂಟಿಕ್ವಿಟಿಯನ್ನ ನಾವು ಮೆಗಾಲಿಥಿಕ್ ಪೀರಿಯಡ್ ಮಾತ್ರವೇ ತಗೊಂಡು ಹೋಗ್ಲಿಕ್ಕೆ ಸಾಧ್ಯ ಆಗ್ತದೆ.
ಅಷ್ಟು ಸಾಕು ಅಂತ ಅನ್ಸುತ್ತೆ ಸರ್ ನನ್ಗೆ.
Thank you, madam.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
ಥ್ಯಾಂಕ್ ಯು ಸರ್, ಥ್ಯಾಂಕ್ ಯು. ಅದು ಆರ್ಕಿಯಾಲಜಿ ವೈಸ್ ನಾನು ಅಷ್ಟು ಯಾವುದು ಓದ್ ತಿಳ್ಕೊಂಡಿಲ್ಲ, ಬಟ್ ಮೇ ಬಿ ಐ ವಿಲ್ ಲುಕ್ ಇನ್ ಟು ಯುವರ್ ವರ್ಕ್. ಐ ಹ್ಯಾವಂಟ್ ಅಂಡ್ ಮೈ ಹೋಲ್ ವಾಟ್ ಎವರ್ ಐ ಹ್ಯಾವ್ ಸ್ಟಡಿಡ್ or read, my interest is not on the origin of cooks at all. I mean, I think there is, you can't basically go back to anybody's origin.
Yeah,
And,
definitely.
yeah, it's I don't think that is what is required right now. And yeah.
ನಮಸ್ಕಾರ, ನಾನು ಭಾಸ್ಕರಮಯ್ಯ.
ನಮಸ್ಕಾರ ಸರ್.
ಎನ್ ಶ್ರೀನಿವಾಸ್ ಮತ್ತೆ ಅಂಬೇಡ್ಕರ್ ಸಮಕಾಲೀನರು ಅಂತ ಹೇಳಿದೆ.
ಹೌದು ಸರ್.
ಎನ್ ಶ್ರೀನಿವಾಸರ ಸೆನ್ಸಿಟೈಸೇಷನ್ ಕಾನ್ಸೆಪ್ಟ್ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ಅಂಬೇಡ್ಕರ್ ಯಾವ ನಿಲುವನ್ನು ತಾಳಿದ್ರು ಮೇಡಮ್?
ಸರ್, ಐ ಡೋಂಟ್ ಥಿಂಕ್ ಶ್ರೀನಿವಾಸ್ ಅವ್ರ ಅಂಬೇಡ್ಕರ್ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ಎಲ್ಲೂ ಹೇಳಿಲ್ಲ. ನೈದರ್ ಹ್ಯಾಸ್ ಅಂಬೇಡ್ಕರ್ ಅವ್ರು ಕೂಡ ಶ್ರೀನಿವಾಸ್. ಆಕ್ಚುಲಿ ಶ್ರೀನಿವಾಸ್ ಅವ್ರು ಪಬ್ಲಿಷ್ ಮಾಡಿದ್ದು 1952. ಅಂಬೇಡ್ಕರ್ ಅವರು 1956 ಅಲ್ಲೇ ತೀರೋದ್ರು. ಸೊ ಐ ಡೋಂಟ್ ಥಿಂಕ್ ಅಂಬೇಡ್ಕರ್ ಅವರು ಶ್ರೀನಿವಾಸ್ ಅವ್ರು ಏನ್ ಬರ್ದಿದ್ದಾರೆ ಅಂತ ಅವ್ರು ಓದಿದಾರೋ ಇಲ್ಲೋ. ನನ್ನೆಲ್ಲೂ ಅಂಬೇಡ್ಕರ್ ಅವ್ರ ವರ್ಕ್ಸ್ ನಾನು ಸುಮಾರಾಗಿ ಓದಿದ್ದೀನಿ, but I have not come across his reference to Srinivas. But what Ambedkar has done is he has understood the process of how Brahminic culture imposed itself on the lower caste. Adre Ambedkar aur en madidare andre, Ambedkar has given a positive value to the lower caste practices. That is what I was trying to say. Instead of saying M.N. Srinivas aur en ಹೇಳ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದಾರೆ, ಕಣ್ ಮುಚ್ಕೊಂಡು ಲೋವರ್ ಕಾಸ್ಟ್ ಅವರು ಆಲ್ಮೋಸ್ಟ್ ದೇ ಹ್ಯಾವ್ ಫಾಲೋಡ್ ದ ಪ್ರಾಕ್ಟಿಸಸ್ ಆಫ್ ದ ಅಪರ್ ಕಾಸ್ಟ್ ಪೀಪಲ್, ರೈಟ್? ದಿಸ್ ಇಸ್ ವಾಟ್ ಹಿ ಕಾಲ್ ಸಾಂಸ್ಕೃತೈಸೇಷನ್. ಆದ್ರೆ ಅಂಬೇಡ್ಕರ್ ಅವರು ಏನ್ ಹೇಳ್ತಾರೆ ಅಂದ್ರೆ, ಲಾರ್ಜ್ಲಿ ಆಲ್ದೋ ದರ್ ಇಸ್ ದಿಸ್ ಹಿಂದೂ ಕಾಸ್ಟ್ ಸಿಸ್ಟಮ್ ದಟ್ ಹ್ಯಾಸ್ ಬೀನ್ ಇಂಪೋಸ್ಡ್ ಆನ್ ಅ ಹೋಲ್ ಲಾಟ್ ಆಫ್ ಅದರ್ ಕಾಸ್ಟ್, he doesn't see the lower caste as blindly imitating. Ambedkar and before him Phule, they have given a certain kind of agency to the lower caste to fight it back, to resist it back. Sanskritization concept ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಈ ಫೈಟಿಂಗ್ ಬ್ಯಾಕ್ ಅನ್ನೋದು, ಏಜೆನ್ಸಿ ಅನ್ನೋದು, ನಮ್ಮ ಮೇಲೆ ನಮ್ ವರ್ತಿ, ನಮ್ ಪ್ರಾಕ್ಟೀಸಸ್ ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಸ್ವಲ್ಪ ವರ್ತ್ ಇದೆ, ವಿ ಆರ್ ಏಬಲ್ ಟು ಅಸರ್ಟ್ ಅವರ್ ಸೆಲ್ಸ್ ಅನ್ನೋದು ಸಾಂಸ್ಕೃತೈಸೇಷನ್ ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಎಲ್ಲೂ ಕಾಣೋದಿಲ್ಲ, ರೈಟ್? ದಟ್ ಇಸ್ ವಾಟ್ ಅಂಬೇಡ್ಕರ್ ಡಿಡ್ to find assertion in oneself, which Sanskritization alla scope illa. But I don't think both of them referred to each other's works.
Okay, thank you, madam.
Thank you, sir.
Soumya, this is Dattatreya. I have a very simple question. Hello, can you hear me?
Simple question ಅಂದಾಗ್ಲೇ ಡೌಟ್ ಬರ್ತದೆ ದತ್ತ.
ಏನಿಲ್ಲ, see, when you attribute these tribal qualities to Kodava specifically, don't think, I mean, ಎಲ್ಲೋ ಒಂದ್ ಕಡೆ you go back in time and attribute this, you try to retrieve a part of history where you're trying to attribute in a particular transitory phase where you say, yes, this particular community or this community ethnic group exhibited these qualities.
Yeah.
Don't you think it is specific to all communities, all non-Brahmin communities across India? Why specifically Coorg, and why does it become, this whole thing of, bari vigorous agi now tribals anta helಕೊಳ್ಳುವಂತ ಒಂದು ಡೆವಲಪ್ಮೆಂಟ್ ಇದೆಯಲ್ಲ past 2 decades ಅಲ್ಲಿ, very politically charged. It's more less cultural than more political. Why there is too many dimensions to it. It is not as simple as adu ಅಷ್ಟುಲ್ವಾ ಕಾಣಲ್ಲ. That's one question. Number 2 ಅಂತ ಹೇಳಿದ್ರೆ, you see, you look at it, and you should have touched upon the tremendous internal hierarchies that Kodavas, particularly the dominant Kodavas, exhibit within the 12 ethnic Kodava communities. In vis-a-vis to Yaravas irbodu, Kembatigalu irbodu, Hegdegalu irbodu, idella noduvaga, how does this community align itself, and particularly their, their strengthening and on the historical, socio-economic mobility ಇದೆಯಲ್ಲ, ಅದಕ್ಕೂ ಮತ್ತು ಅವರ collaborative effort with the colonial rulers, particularly in the last century. ಅವೆರಡು ಅಂಶಗಳ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ನಿಮ್ಮ ಏನಾದ್ರೂ ಮಾಹಿತಿ ಇದ್ರೆ ಹೇಳಿ.
So the first question, this understanding of any community as a non-Hindu or within a indigenous tribal kind of a cultural frame, it's true for many communities in India. I agree that there is no doubt about it, and this may just support the fact that Sanskritization has to be relooked. So yes, and this is not just me who's saying. I think in Kanchailaya's now well-known book, Why I'm Not a Hindu, he says this very clearly, that most other backward classes are essentially non-Hindu, practice very non-Brahminical kind of practices, and therefore can be understood as indigenous or as tribals, however one prefers it to be. It is true, it's not just Kodavas. In fact, most communities can be understood as non-Brahminical. I agree, it's not just Kodavas. Second, yes, there are a whole lot of internal hierarchies among the communities that are native to Kodagu. I thought throughout it is embedded in my paper that the Kodavas are dominant locally, and there are hierarchies, whether within the language they speak or in their socio-economic relations among a whole lot of communities. Maybe when I'm presenting this virtually, it was not very clear, but yes, I had, in the sense, written it embedded in the paper. Just like you can't separate gender from anything else, I don't think I can separate this dominance or the hierarchy from any kind of idea we are talking about Kodava. So if it didn't come across, then it is my problem. But yes, I had attempted to do this, to bring this aspect as well. But I also think that is that kind of a research is yet to come, talking about the internal complications and hierarchies that are very, very prevalent within Coorg, especially in the relationship of the landholding Kodavas and the Eravas, and also other communities in Coorg. Yeah.
Hello.
And I'm not very sure if the last 2 decades movement for tribal status among the Kodavas is more political than cultural. I would say it is a cultural anxiety rather than a political anxiety for the Kodavas, right? I mean, if it means if you mean political in the real political sense, in the electoral politics, Kodavas are hardly significant in the electoral politics, so that doesn't make any kind of sense. But if in politics, if we mean the politics of reservation and stuff, that is also complex, is what I think, because many Kodavas, even people who argue for a tribal status, do not see themselves as a scheduled tribe who's seeking reservation. So, but there is also a section of Kodavas within this who argue that reservation will benefit Kodavas, at least in Coorg, where, I mean, people have moved out of their own choice. Kodavas have moved out of their own choice, but still, it's a cultural anxiety that fuels this politics, is what I think.
But at some point, I feel they're comfortably aligned with, with their pork. We can call them pandikadi Hindutva, you know, that sort of an.
That's true. It's not just Pandikari Hindutva. I think this Pandikari Hindutva is very convenient to take a stance against the Muslims. So I think it works in multiple ways. It's an anti-Muslim stance. It's very
Not only
convenient.
Muslims, even the lower hierarchies, you know, within the Hindu community, so-called Hindu community, I think it's an exclusivist category. It is not an inclusivist category at all. So I think that angle, you know, they are comfortably aligned. And if you look at, there is also some sort of a religious cultural migration from their core Kodawa beliefs to what you can call as the mainstream deities. I see a lot of Kodavas these days going to either Dharmasthala or Tirupati. You know, there is a shift.
There is.
So so they're delocalizing their religion too. So they're aligning themselves to what we call as the Brahminical hierarchy of gods. So that's something which is rapidly happening. So I think that angle. So if there is an cultural anxiety, they should have addressed that question very seriously. I don't think they are addressing it properly. So I think there is some problem there. You know, so anyone who has worked on
You're right. CNC's arguments are largely based on the essentialized notion of Kodava. It also doesn't speak about the shifts in Kodava practices, right? Whatever you have pointed out and many more. Even CNC has this stereotype notion of Kodava practices, which which is very idealist and purist in many senses. It's not dynamic, so to speak.
Okay. ಬೇರೆ ಯಾರದಾದ್ರೂ ಪ್ರಶ್ನೆಗಳಿದ್ರೆ ಕೇಳಬಹುದು. ಅದರ್ವೈಸ್ ಸೆಷನ್ ಅನ್ನ there is one question which appeared in Facebook Live by Vidyadhara Kudekalu, that do you think worship of Igutappa and Kaveri is recent development among Kodavas? If not, isn't it Sanskritization?
There are records that say that the temple of Igutappa, although Igutappa is known as the god of food, it's now become a Shiva temple. And the temples in Kaveri, which are around Ganapati and Shiva, they're all built by the Lingayat kings, right? So they are recent developments. And as Srinivas pointed out, the religion of the rulers that were taken up, that was imposed on the people of Kodagu. Yes, there is, and also as Dr. Dattatreya pointed out, there are also other practices that point out towards certain practices that are quite prevalent today. But as I replied to Jyoti's question, you can't see any community within one set of identity practices, right? So that is true for any community. So one has to understand identity within a whole lot of other practices that one practice or not practice, and so on and so forth. So there are aspects. Yes, Kaveri and Igutappa are recent and maybe last 200 years old or so, but then there are other things also that Kodavas do along with this.
I think with this ಪ್ರಶ್ನೆಗಳಿದೆ. ಯಾರದಾದ್ರು ಯಾರೋ ಅನ್ಮ್ಯೂಟ್ ಮಾಡಿದ್ರು. ಓಕೆ, ಬಹುತೇಕ ಪ್ರಶ್ನೆಗಳು ಮುಗಿದಿದೆ ಮತ್ತು ಬಹುತೇಕ ಪ್ರಶ್ನೆಗಳು ಮುಗಿದಿದೆ. ಥ್ಯಾಂಕ್ ಯು ಸೌಮ್ಯ ಫಾರ್ ಎ ಬ್ಯೂಟಿಫುಲ್ ಲೆಕ್ಚರ್ ಅಂಡ್ ಬ್ಯೂಟಿಫುಲ್ ಕ್ವಶನ್ ಅಂಡ್ ಆನ್ಸರ್ ದಟ್ ಇಸ್ ಫಾಲೋಡ್. ಬೆಂಗಳೂರು ಹಿಸ್ಟೋರಿಯನ್ ಸೊಸೈಟಿ, ಇತಿಹಾಸ ದರ್ಪಣ ಮತ್ತು ಋತುಮಾನ.com ಮೂರು ವೇದಿಕೆ ಮತ್ತು ಮೂರನ್ನು ರೆಪ್ರೆಸೆಂಟ್ ಮಾಡುವ ಬೆಂಗಳೂರು ಹಿಸ್ಟೋರಿಯನ್ ಸೊಸೈಟಿಯ ಡಾಕ್ಟರ್ ಎಸ್ ಕೆ ಅರುಣಿ ಹಾಗೂ ಇತಿಹಾಸ ದರ್ಪಣದ ಹಂಗು ರಾಜೇಶ್ ಮತ್ತು ಋತುಮಾನ.com ನಿತೇಶ್ ಕುಂಟಾಡಿ ಹಾಗೂ ನೆರೆದಿರ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥ ಎಲ್ಲ ಆತ್ಮೀಯ ಆಡಿಯನ್ಸ್ ಏನಿದ್ದಾರೆ ಅವರ ಪರವಾಗಿ ನಾನು ಸೌಮ್ಯ ಅವರಿಗೆ ಆತ್ಮೀಯ ಧನ್ಯವಾದಗಳನ್ನ ಹೇಳ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದೇನೆ. ಥ್ಯಾಂಕ್ ಯು ವೆರಿ ಮಚ್.
ನಿಮ್ಗೂ ಅಷ್ಟೇ. ಅಂಡ್ ಆಲ್ 3 ಆರ್ಗನೈಸರ್ಸ್, ಬ್ಯಾಂಗ್ಳೂರ್ ಹಿಸ್ಟೋರಿಯನ್ ಸೊಸೈಟಿ, ಋತುಮಾನ ಮತ್ತು ಇತಿಹಾಸ ದರ್ಪಣ, ಇವ್ರಿಗೆಲ್ಲರಿಗೂ ನನ್ನ ಲಾಟ್ ಆಫ್ ಥ್ಯಾಂಕ್ಸ್. ಸ್ಪೆಷಲಿ ಪ್ರದೀಪ್ who asked me to talk. Thank you very much. And yes, there are a whole lot of things. These are actually questions that keep coming in, and questions that make me think about what I've written, what I think, and so on. Thank you very much for the questions. Thank you for this opportunity. Thanks, Pradeep.
ಥ್ಯಾಂಕ್ ಯು. ಎಲ್ರಿಗೂ ಕೂಡ ದೀಪಾವಳಿ ಶುಭಾಶಯ. ಮತ್ತೆ ಇಂತಹ ಅನೇಕ ಸಂದರ್ಭ ಸಿಗಲಿ, ಕೊಡವ ಐಡೆಂಟಿಟಿಯ ಬಗೆಗೆ ಸಾಕಷ್ಟು ಸಂವಾದಗಳು ನಡೆಯಲಿ ಅಂತ ಹೇಳ್ತಾ ಇವತ್ತಿನ ಸೆಷನ್ ಅನ್ನ ಮುಕ್ತಾಯಗೊಳಿಸ್ತಿದ್ವಿ. ಎಲ್ರಿಗೂ ಕೂಡ ನಮಸ್ಕಾರ. ಥ್ಯಾಂಕ್ ಯು ವೆರಿ ಮಚ್.
Thank you.